Well, yo there, my ladles, gentle soups, and all assorted cutlery besides. If you're just joining me, this is in fact part 2 of a 2-part double feature on how to win Eurovision. If you haven't seen part 1 just yet, then I do strongly suggest you go back and watch that first and then come back here, because we'll be picking up where I left off at the end of that video. And if you're joining me off the back of that previous part, then welcome back. It's the festive season, or maybe it's January, or maybe it's even later, depending on whether or not you're a Patreon supporter, but that's completely fine. Let's cut the waffle and dive right back into my master plan on how to lay claim to Eurovision glory once and for all. Roll the opening titles. Hello everyone, I am Tessellating Hexagons, and depending on what your circumstances are after that intro, either welcome or welcome back to my grand unified theory on what it takes to win Eurovision. Just to recap really quickly, this and the previous video are based on a dissertation that I wrote whilst in college in late 2013, early 2014, before the 2014 contest. It was meant to be around 5,000 words long, and my work clocked in at over 7,500 by the end of things, but I'm not here to brag, just to share the fruits of my work so that people may potentially prosper from it. And in case you were wondering, yes, I did actually achieve the highest possible grade for that particular qualification, so there is some credibility to what I'm saying here, but like I said, not here to brag. Much. Anyway, while I'd like to think you've definitely taken the opportunity to go back and watch or re-watch my previous video on this by now, let's refresh, anyway, the key idea that underpins my whole thesis. That is, Eurovision success boils down to what I call the 4 S's. That's sentiment, singer, song, and staging. In the last video, I talked about sentiment and singer in great depth. That is, how your country should feel about the contest and who is the best candidate in a number of fields of consideration. So now it's time to give proper attention to the other 2 components in that little proposition, and they certainly are heavy and important items, so, you know, listen up. So, from this video, you can expect an analysis of what kind of song you should be aiming for in terms of style, presentation, language, tone, lyrics, and all the trimmings, and how to put that across effectively on stage, from pyrotechnics to choreography to the more simple stuff like how to pose and portray the singer. And on top of all of that, I'll do my utmost to tie everything together with a nice, neat, Tess-flavoured ribbon, and by the end, you might just be good to go so you can report back to your local head of delegation with how your country could absolutely nail it next year. I am talking to you, Liechtenstein. I've seen your plans for a ballsy 2018 debut. Don't let us down. One last thing I just want to refresh you lovely people on before we go any further though. My original dissertation, as I said, was written in 2013, but I have done what I can to bring its research forwards with more recent data. As it stands, all the overarching points that I made remain relevant to this day, funnily enough, which just goes to show how solid my theories were and still are. That said, one core theme that I would like to reiterate is that even in my original thesis I established that there is no single formula for guaranteed success, so don't go suing me if you're expecting some kind of mathematical equation for Eurovision glory. I'm just promoting a winning mindset over here, but as they say, mind over matter. Right, well, let's get started. Next things next on the agenda, after, of course, sentiment and singer, let's talk about the song. By all accounts, this is far and away the most important part of the package to absolutely nail. There's no two ways about it. Some fans are very eager to point out that it's the Eurovision song contest, especially if you try to point out that the other 3 S's also matter, but hey. Granted though, more so than any of the other 4 S's, if you don't have a song, you are going nowhere fast, so they deserve a little bit of credit, but I mean, the other S's do matter, it's just this one matters the most. There is one elephant in the room that we ought to address right from the outset though, the lyrics. Here's a chart showing the language of every winning entry since 1956, and as you can see, there's a huge trend in favour of English. But don't be fooled. My thesis made it explicitly clear that it was only going to factor in data from the modern contest, which I define as starting with the introduction of the semi-final stage in 2004. Conveniently, at the time, that meant I was only considering 10 years worth of winners in my original study, and that already shifts the landscape just a little. Now add in how things look in the present day, that is, December 2017 or January 2018 if you're not a Patreon supporter, suddenly English doesn't seem to hold quite the same weight as it used to now, does it? But there is a little something to learn here. Time was, English was the most common language for a winner to perform in because it's the closest thing that Europe has to a common language, albeit somewhat begrudgingly in some cases. Before more of the Eastern European countries joined the contest, there was heavy representation of the French language amidst the winners as well, because, especially in Western Europe, French is also not far off from being a common language of sorts, particularly in countries that reject English as that potential common ground. That's why Eurovision is presented in both English and French, regardless of the host nation, so as many people as possible have the best chance of understanding. So with that being the case, well, what's changed with the winners then? Strictly speaking, nothing. However, maybe we, as a collective, would like to think that we've entered some kind of age of enlightenment, where the meaning of the song supersedes the language it's performed in, and actually, that's not too far off the truth. In 2017 especially, we heard it from the fandom's mouth directly. Portugal's Salvador Sobral was so popular, supposedly, because the intensity and sincerity of his emotions transcended language to touch people's hearts, or so I've been told. I still don't particularly— I'm not getting back into that discussion because the fandom are incapable of thinking maturely about it. Anyway, this rings true for Jamala as well. Admittedly, her winning song was largely in English, but unlike most Eurovision entries that are split roughly 80-20 between English and the singer's native language, the Crimean Tatar section of the song was in the song's refrain, not as a bridge towards the end, so it was repeated throughout the song, and it was the song's identifying segment. And it carried deep meaning, because, again, the song told a personal story, which Jamala was able to convey with absolute sincerity, and so it went on to grab the attention of the voting public and the juries, though her amazing singing voice probably had a helping hand in that. Alright, so what am I wanting you to take away from that then? Well, to put it in much more tactful terms than a certain winner's speech, the current European zeitgeist is one that favours open sincerity over flashy presentation. That's not to say there isn't room for dazzling, more vapid songs. I mean, just look at the songs that came third in both 2016 and 2017. The hard truth, though, is there is room for all genres of song, no questions asked, because, believe it or not, everyone has different tastes and listens to music for different reasons. Basic uses and gratifications theory right there. But I digress. What I mean to say is, there's nothing wrong with sending a song that's intentionally depthless, but, by that same token, at the moment in Eurovision, you're no longer at a disadvantage if you want to share a deep, personal message in your native language. You'll no longer be shouted down by the glitzier songs. Admittedly, tastes will vary over the years, so that may not hold true for the rest of eternity, but that's how it is at the moment in late 2017, going into early 2018. So, to bring lyrics and language under a single roof as far as rationalization goes, just understand this. Pick your language based on your message and your intentions. If you want total sincerity and you want to be totally meaningful, don't try to force in broken English, especially if you don't speak it natively, because it may well dilute your message and make you seem insincere or as if you're pandering. Conversely, if you want a song that doesn't rely on being taken with grave seriousness, if you want a song that people can dance to and let go of their troubles to and enjoy openly, this matters much less. But I think it goes without saying that a native language lyric will always be better received than a line of broken English that sounds out of place for the sake of being shoehorned in. And that brings us neatly onto what subject matter you should or shouldn't broach when writing with the Eurovision stage in mind. And when I say that, most Eurovision fans really ought to immediately find themselves thinking of Georgia's ill-fated entry from 2009, Stefane and the 3G's We Don't Want to Put In, which was barred from the contest for containing political content. So, right out of the gate, bear in mind that, and the likes of Valentina Monetta's debut entry, amongst others, which had to be edited to remove direct references to Facebook. Admittedly, recent years appear to have slackened a bit over whether or not you're allowed to mention brands by name, if only by way of letting brand names in through loopholes rather than prohibiting anything outright if it could be misconstrued, but, well, it's just better to avoid that whole mess to begin with. So, in short, don't get political and don't get corporate. It never ends well. And that's all well and good saying don't do this and don't do that, but, well, what should one do then? Honestly, the sky is actually more or less the limit at this point in time. We've had Eurovision entries about everything from grave issues like child abuse and genocide to much more light-hearted ones about baking a cake or just outright declaring oneself to be the winner ahead of time. And we've had pretty much everything in between those as well. There's nothing at this point that's been untouched. Naturally though, some topics are more preferred than others, so think carefully, but ultimately it is all about your approach. Hypothetically, there is no absolutely prohibited topic, within reason. But in practice, if you start singing about, for instance, abuse of any kind, or anything that you might call an adult fear, anything like that, you have to be very, very painstakingly careful about how you go about it, to the point that unless you're telling your own personal story, and sincerely, and that you're not stating that that kind of behaviour is in any way good, if you don't do all that, you're better off just not touching the subject at all. However, there is a flip side to that. If you want the lyrics to your song to just be a means to an end and have the music do all the heavy lifting for the sake of dancing and just having a party time, don't expect your song to be taken groundbreakingly seriously. Don't pretend that gibberish is high art, to use an extreme example that's not really based on any one particular entry. Really, the secret, once again, is knowing thyself. Let's take a closer look at the subject matter of the recent winners, shall we? Broadly, winning songs tend to fall into a small handful of distinct categories. Songs to thoroughly entertain, songs that tell a personal story, and songs to empower. What remains after that first tier tends to focus on singing about the sensations of being in love, whether that's at its highest, its lowest, or somewhere special in between. The idea in those cases is to evoke empathy through a fictionalized story that is relatable to most people, as opposed to the true enough emotional presentations of the personal story genre, which appeal more to empathy as opposed to narrative sympathy. And here's the coup de grace, if I'm using that phrase even remotely accurately. Notice that each of these genres has one huge thing in common. They all focus on seeking a direct emotional response from the audience. You could argue that by having a contest where the main goal is to entertain for 3 minutes against a load of other countries doing the same thing, that every entry, regardless of where it finishes, has that same aim, and while you're not wrong to say that, per se, the winners do tend to go above and beyond to get that reaction. Take Mons and Loreen, for example. Both focused heavily on flashing lights and intensely choreographed staging down to a T, which is something I'll come back to in a moment. Their intention was to mesmerize, to leave the audience craving more. Jamala and Salvador, meanwhile, poured all of their focus into revealing their heart to the audience and encouraging the audience to look inside themselves and empathize with their true stories on a deeply human level. And then there's the likes of Alexander Rybak, Dima Bilan, and most notably Conchita from 2014, who delivered songs with a heavy overtone of self-empowerment or the empowerment of others, whether that's as the mysterious and awe-inspiring lover of Rybak's fairy tale, as anyone who feels downtrodden and in need of a raison d'etre through Believe, or a member of the LGBTQ+ community, or any community for that matter, that feels in need of Conchita's rallying cry through the story she tells in Rise Like a Phoenix. All of this, in essence, is a really roundabout way of saying when you write a song, believe in it, no matter what you're writing. The greatest error you can commit is writing a song just for the sake of writing a song, unless the song is about being written for the sake of being written. If you write a song about writing a song, that's a bit more okay, but if you just write a song because it's something you can just pump out for a bit of easy money, then don't do it. That's part of the reason why I famously take against the works of Thomas Gerson Gustafsson. I may be completely mistaken on this, and I will freely own that and apologise if necessary, but at the rate he churns out songs for Eurovision hopefuls and Eurovision competitors alike, I find it very hard to believe that he truly has the time to believe in every note or every lyric he writes, much less the artists that he writes them for. But I don't mean to call him out specifically, it's just an example of where my mind is relative to this whole hornet's nest. The bottom line is, just be true to yourself, which I know sounds trite and cliche, but if you have a story, tell it. If you don't, still bring your truest self to the song. Again, it sounds very waffy, but it's true. There's not really a concrete way of saying it. They say that even children can spot insincerity from several miles away, and that holds true of Eurovision fans too. Just be honest, be real, and just make the audience feel something. Just something other than disappointment anyway. Having said all of that though, and I don't mean to undermine that point, not in the slightest, but we do still need to talk about the final S. Final since it's the last thing to come up chronologically. But yes, it's come time that we discuss the importance of staging, and it cannot be overstated. After all, I've already done a top 10 countdown of my personal favourite and or most impactful Eurovision stage performances, and while I can't say I necessarily like all of the songs on that list, I did absolutely love how they were all presented on the night, no exceptions. So, allow me to, quite personally, set the scene. You've had your national selection, or internal selection, if you can't find your own artist, store-bought is fine. Your entire country is completely behind your delegation. You've got the loveliest, worldliest singer or group with the voice of 1,000 angels and a song that tells a viciously personal story that connects with the audience, and anyone who listens to it falls in love with it. You get to the host city, you see the stage, and then the penny drops. What now? Before we go into too much detail, I think it's necessary for me to bring all of you lovely people up to speed on what actually happens at that point in actual Eurovision. Already, prior to arriving at the host city, in fact about a month prior if my sources are correct, if not further back, each delegation is shown the design of the stage and what it's capable of, and in return must submit a proposal treatment sort of document for what they want to do with the stage on the night. I presume there is then some back and forth between them and the creative production team at Eurovision, telling them what they can and can't do of what they want to do, and whittling it down to something a bit more doable. By the time they get to the venue, they have, in all likelihood, at least, already worked out some level of choreography and the overall storyboard, so to speak, of what they want to do and have happen on the stage. And it's all rehearsals from there, just to see where the idea develops and what restrictions they run into, what they can do, what they can't do, what would make it better, and so on and so on. After each rehearsal session, the delegation, that is everyone on stage, including the artist and their backing singers and backing dancers, as well as representatives from that country's broadcaster, plus whichever choreographers, etc. they may have brought with them, they all go into a private room to watch the rehearsal footage back and take notes on what to change for next time. You know, what camera angles to use, what the artist should do at this point in the song instead of what they've been doing so far, and so on and so forth. And there are several rounds of this for each show, as I'm sure you know. It's also around this point where the delegation tells the host broadcaster which 20-ish second snippet of the performance they want to use in the show's recaps. So, why am I telling you this exactly? Well, it's vital to understand what materials each delegation has to play with in constructing their stage presence, and the time spent actually engaging with the stage and rehearsing are absolutely part of those materials. These things take meticulous planning, which is why it's absolutely crucial to go into these things with a game plan ahead of time. So what does each delegation have at their disposal then? First and foremost, a budget. This shouldn't vary between delegations in the name of fairness, but it does tend to. This is part of the reason why Eurovision participation is so expensive. That budget has to cover equipment such as microphones and microphone stands for the singers and backing artists, choreography and vocal coaching before even reaching the venue, costumes, props, pyrotechnics, and holograms if they choose to include them. To my understanding, the visuals on the floor and walls and any other part of the stage with screens on, as well as coloured lights or lighting in general, those don't need paying for in the same way, but I might be wrong there. After all, someone has to put those stunning visualizations together, since, you know, they don't just appear at the push of a button. Someone has to put work into those, so I'd imagine they probably want paying for it. And what combination of those leads to a winning stage presentation? Say it with me, O lovely people of mine. Know thyself. Once again, it's all about knowing what fits your song. At one's most embittered, you could be completely right to stand up and say that that's a total no-brainer, but it does bear repeating, funnily enough. Staging is notoriously easy to get wrong. If your song is big and bombastic, then sure, by all means, go ham with the pyros and the lights, the visuals, the props, whatever comes to mind. But if you're going for a heavy, sincere atmosphere, as is popular at the moment, you need to play it carefully. Before we go any further, I would like to share a fairly recent cautionary tale. Perhaps not the best example for what I want to say, comes to us from Belgium's 2017 offering. I know I'm not the only one who criticised the delegation's hands-off approach in putting together their staging that year, because it really showed. City Lights required intimate, careful, stylised staging with unique camera shots and clever effects and such like. What was actually presented was a terrified singer caught in the headlights, swallowed up by a big dress and an even bigger stage. There was a lot of potential there, and it was squandered because the artist was simply left to her own devices without any direction from the people who were supposed to know what they were doing. And yet the act still placed fourth. But just think, would she have done better if the staging had been less lackluster? I would say most likely. And that isn't an isolated incident. This, more than anything else, is what I mean when I say that the staging has to fit the song. Don't even question it. In the same way that we see medicine bottles that say, "Do not operate heavy machinery when taking this medicine," and then we think, "I don't even own a forklift truck," when in reality it's talking about driving a car. And bear with me, I am going somewhere with this. It's a weird analogy, but it fits, trust me. So, in the same way as that, it sounds like I'm advising against over-egging a performance with too much in the special effects department, and, well, I am, but I'm just as strongly warning about underselling a performance. Don't forget, nowadays the Eurovision stage is positively enormous. If your song is quiet, if your song is intimate, if it's emotionally deep, atmospherically heavy, if you only have one or two singers, you need to put the work in to make sure they still leave that impression, instead of looking like they're lost in a very LED heavy version of outer space. And this applies to big songs too. If they have a big, powerful song but the stage looks empty with a singer in the middle of it, it still doesn't feel quite right. You need to give it thought. The principal takeaway there is, make sure you're memorable. If your singer looks lost, well, psychologically, we, the audience, are going to feel disconnected from them, and it becomes so much easier to disengage from the performance outright. Conversely, if your approach is too aggressive and in your face, it stands to lose viewer support because it seems too desperate for attention. It's the Eurovision equivalent of crazy, wacky, in-your-face 3D kids films like The Adventures of Shark Boy and Lava Girl. That's right, I went there. And that ties into the wardrobe and props departments too. It's all well and good wearing a wild, weird outfit and brandishing a crazy prop you found in a skipper on the back of the local equivalent to Ann Summers, but shock factor really does not cut the mustard when it comes to onstage presentation. I'll save you the research and tell you that when it comes to the Barbara Dex Award winners, for those not in the know, that's a fan-awarded prize for the worst dressed artist at the contest, 4 of the past 5 winners of that award failed to qualify for the final outright, and the one that did qualify for the final finished 23rd out of 26. Dressing to shock does not leave a positive impression. Admittedly, the 6th most recent Barbara Dex winner did finish 5th overall in the contest, but that performance did everything else right from this dissertation, and the outfit wasn't that outlandish, it was just a bit weird and onion bargy looking, but it was fine. But I think that's enough said on my part. As you may well have noticed when you get right down to it, my whole thesis is rather bare bones if you're looking for a straightforward send an artist of this gender and this age singing in this language and at that tempo in this genre in that key in these languages. If you're looking for that kind of formula, and as far as I can tell, it really does feel like all I'm doing here is spouting long-winded common sense. But hey, that's just what university feels like, am I right? The difference is I'm doing this for relatively cheap, if not free, depending on how long you're willing to wait for it, but hey-ho. But it really does need to be listened to and understood as far as I understand things. After all, understanding what one brings to the table is the biggest linchpin to every successful Eurovision entry, and the absence of that can be found as the root cause for too many failed attempts to name. So, trust me, I know what I'm talking about. However, I can tell you 2 little secrets that could possibly fast-track you to doing relatively well, since you've been so kind as to listen to me waffle on like this for so long. 1. If things don't work out for you in any given year, bounce back. Don't take failure to qualify or failure to win or whatever as a personal affront. 2nd place is not the first of the losers. Just keep trying. Give it your best. In that regard, the head of delegation from Montenegro, who gave a statement a few years ago echoing that exact sentiment, has absolutely the right attitude, and if you look at their track record at the contest, sure, they've qualified twice, but they always send something new, and they always bounce back, and they're always willing to keep trying. That's completely the right idea. Learn from Montenegro. And secondly, perhaps this is just a pet peeve on my part, but Eurovision songs written without restrictions tend to fare very well in every aspect of what I've just laid out. On the surface, that might sound like a contradiction. Keeping in line with everything I just said over these 2 videos is the very definition of restricting oneself. But what I mean is, don't write a song just specifically for Eurovision and nothing else. Don't write around the idea of it being exclusively for the Eurovision stage and all of the trimmings that go with that. Amar Pelos Dois was written as a labour of love, with no especial interest in competing at Eurovision at first. 1944 was part of a personal endeavour that ended up in a national final because it was in the right place at the right time. Heroes was written as an album single intended to chart. Obviously, there are more examples of this, but it doesn't apply to every winner ever. But if your song is natively from the real world, it's already much more likely to make a genuine connection. You know, as opposed to stepping on stage singing, "This is my song for Eurovision." And why is that? Simple. If you write exclusively for Eurovision, you're constantly reminding people with the thing that they're supposed to be remembering you for that what they're watching is an artificial show, and that anything you might be making them feel is, accordingly, entirely artificial. That it's just there for entertainment value and nothing else. Like it's hollow happiness or hollow empathy. It undermines its values. If it's a song that's just as real no matter where you hear it, not only is it more likely to do well commercially and self-advertise in so doing, thus gaining popular traction anyway, it also avoids reminding the audience that it is all one big show and not much else besides in that regard, and so the emotions that they're made to feel will feel a bit more genuine because it's not, you are only feeling this because you're in the right place at the right time watching me on this stage, look at me here. I mean, granted, a fair counterpoint is, okay, Emily DeForest 2013, one of the lines is, come and face me now on this stage tonight, but I feel as though that doesn't refer to the Eurovision stage specifically. That's more of a metaphorical, come and join Emily on her pedestal and let's talk this out kind of stage, as opposed to, look at me, I'm on a Eurovision stage, hi mom! You know, it's not that sort of thing. Do you see what I'm driving at? I hope you do, because I know how I can be sometimes. But for now, I really ought to sign off. I've been bending your ear in the name of sharing my thesis for too long now, and so I do thank you most sincerely for listening. I'm hoping that that conclusion was an adequate tying together of my ideas in lieu of just recapping everything I said over the last 20 minutes, but, well, if it isn't, I'm afraid that's all you're getting, as you can sort of tell by how long this video is. And speaking of thanks, you know what time it is at this point. Yes, indeed, time that I thanked my lovely supporters over on patreon.com/TessHex, who got to see this video a whole month before anyone else. So if you want to be a part of that most elite of clubs, and get a whole load of lovely perks besides that, then you're quite welcome to join the campaign for as little as $1 per video. It's not required by any means, but these videos wouldn't be happening without the support that I get from those loveliest of people, so, you know, just a thought to throw around in there. Once again though, I shall leave that thought with you, along with the notion that, as always, I have been, and will continue to be, Tessellating Hexagons, and I look forward to gracing your screen again, when next you'll allow me to. Until then.